The dosimetry board crossed 4 minutes and 12 seconds when I first noticed the human had slowed her pace. Not stopped. Slowed. The way a person slows when something on a shelf catches their eye, a mild, unhurried deceleration, the body still moving forward while the attention briefly elsewhere. She was looking at the wall markings, the exposure band indicators, the colored strips we paint at 1 meter intervals so that organisms in distress can orient themselves toward the egress end of the traverse corridor. She appeared to be reading them. I remember thinking, she is trying to find her way out. She has felt the onset and she is looking for the exit marker. This was incorrect. My name is Soveth Keelerun. I hold the rank of Senior Containment Biologist, 3rd tier, at the Drevry Institute of Biological Hazard Assessment. I have administered controlled exposure traverse protocols on 43 distinct species across 11 years of active classification work. I am delivering this testimony because the Institute's review board has asked, for the 3rd time in 4 years, that I provide a formal on-record account of the events of the 44th classification session. I will do so now without abbreviation. The human's name was Specialist Dara Osei. She was 31 years old by her species calendar, a xenobiological liaison attached to the joint research compact that had delivered her to our station 6 weeks prior. She stood a fraction below average height for an adult female of her species, with a compact build the intake forms described as within normal parameters, a phrase I have since revisited more times than I can count. She had been cooperative throughout the intake process. She had asked intelligent questions about our equipment. When I explained the traverse protocol, the corridor, the exposure band, the dosimetry monitoring, the standard egress at the distress threshold, she had nodded and asked how long it usually took. I told her the distress threshold for most catalogued carbon-based life fell between 90 seconds and 4 minutes, depending on body mass and baseline radiation tolerance. She had nodded again and said, simply, "Okay." The standard traverse corridor at Exclusion Assessment Station Drevry 11 is 22 meters long. The ambient field inside is held at a fixed Class 7 radiation intensity, the level we use because it produces measurable biological response data quickly without destroying soft tissue in the first seconds of exposure, which would compromise the readings. Class 7 is not our most intense test environment. It is, however, well above the threshold at which every catalogued carbon-based organism in our database begins to experience irreversible cellular breakdown. The 4-minute mark is not a soft limit. It is the point beyond which our models predict 0 survivable outcomes for any organism we have ever classified. At 4 minutes under Class 7 exposure, the cellular repair mechanisms that most species possess, and all species possess some, are simply overwhelmed. The damage accumulates faster than any known biological process can address it. The organism enters systemic failure. It does not recover. I want the board to understand that I believe this. I had believed it for 11 years. I had 43 classification sessions confirming it. The 4-minute wall was not a hypothesis. It was the most reproducible result in our field. Specialist Osei entered the traverse corridor at exactly the standard pace, a normal walking stride, perhaps slightly deliberate, the way subjects often are when they know they are being observed. The dosimetry array began recording immediately. I was at the primary console. My colleague Reth Vaughan was managing the cellular scan relay. Board observers Council Merith Odin and Senior Assessor Pravel Koss were attending via remote link from the Institute main campus, their feed running on the secondary display to my left. The first 90 seconds produced unremarkable data. Mild surface tissue ionization, consistent with early exposure. Nothing outside the expected range for an organism of her mass. I noted that her stride had not changed. Some subjects slow almost immediately, a stress response, the body registering the environment as hostile before the damage itself is significant. She had not slowed. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, Reth spoke. He said the cellular scan was showing something he wanted me to look at. I looked. The ionization signature in the deeper tissue layers was not climbing. It had climbed, steadily, through the first 2 minutes, and then it had plateaued. Not leveled off in the way that sometimes occurs when a subject's baseline tolerance is slightly higher than modeled, and the initial rate simply slows before the inevitable accumulation. Plateaued. Flat. As though the damage were not accumulating further. I asked Reth if the relay was lagging. He checked. It was not. The human continued walking. At 3 minutes and 50 seconds, I began the egress alert sequence. This is standard procedure. At 4 minutes, we open the far end of the corridor and begin verbal guidance toward the exit. We do not wait for the subject to show distress, because by the time distress is visible, the cascade has typically already passed the point of intervention. I had my hand on the release toggle. Specialist dose reached the 4-minute mark. The dosimetry board registered it with a soft tone, the tone I had heard 43 times before, always followed by some version of the same event, the subject stopping, turning, a change in gait, a reach toward the wall. The recognition that the body is failing. She slowed. She looked at the wall markings. She appeared to be reading them. I opened the corridor. I began the verbal guidance. I told her in standard that the egress was open, that she should move toward the light at the far end, that she was doing well. She looked up from the wall markings. She looked toward the far end of the corridor. She nodded once and kept walking. At 4 minutes and 50 seconds, the cellular scan began showing something I had no category for. The ionization signature, which had plateaued, was declining. Not leveling further. Declining. The damage already recorded in the peripheral tissue layers was being addressed. Actively. By the organism's own cellular processes, in real time, under full Class 7 exposure. I did not say anything for a long moment. Senior Assessor Pravel Kos, on the remote link, asked me to confirm the scan array was calibrated. I confirmed it. He asked me to run a secondary verification. Reth ran it. The array was functioning within nominal tolerance. The readings were accurate. Specialist Osei, 12 seconds past the 4-minute wall, under Class 7 irradiation, was repairing the damage as fast as it was being done. She was still walking. At 6 minutes, she paused again. She had reached the midpoint of the corridor, 11 meters in, and she stopped and turned around slowly, looking at the full length of it, the way a person sometimes looks back at a road they've just walked to see how far they've come. Then she turned forward again and continued. The scan at 8 minutes showed a cellular damage profile that I can only describe as negligible. Not low. Not within the range I would use the word elevated to describe. Negligible. The word I use to file readings that are not clinically significant. Under Class 7 irradiation, at 8 minutes, her tissue was showing a damage profile I would expect from mild, brief background level exposure. The kind a Drevery researcher takes on during a standard shift walking between the shielded and unshielded sections of the station. Counsel Merithoden said, on the link, Soveth, what are we looking at? It was not a question in the way she phrased it. I told her I did not yet know. The human reached 15 meters at the 10-minute mark. She had settled into a slightly slower stride than she'd entered with, not the slow of distress, the slow of someone who has been walking at a measured pace for 10 minutes and has allowed their gait to find its natural rhythm. She rolled her shoulders once. She put her hands in the pockets of the monitoring chute. At 12 minutes, Reth sent me a notation in the console queue. I read it without looking away from the corridor feed. He had run a preliminary comparison against the intake biometric baseline. The aggregate cellular damage score at 12 minutes under Class 7 exposure was lower than the score recorded on intake, from standard transit radiation absorbed during Specialist Osei's approach to the station aboard a non-shielded compact vessel. She was healthier inside the corridor than she had been when she arrived. I did not share that with the board link at the time. I filed it and continued to watch. At 16 minutes, she stopped a third time. She had reached the 20-meter mark, 2 meters from the far end of the corridor, 2 meters from the egress. She stood there for perhaps 8 seconds. Then she turned and walked back toward the midpoint. I asked her, via the corridor audio, if she was experiencing any discomfort. She said no. She said she was fine. She asked how long the test was supposed to run. I told her there was no upper time limit. The standard protocol ended at subject egress or distress. She said she'd figured she'd see more of the corridor, since she'd walked all the way down already, and asked if that was all right. I told her it was all right. She walked back to the 5-meter mark and turned and walked the full length again. At 19 minutes, Senior Assessor Kos asked me, in a very quiet voice over the link, what the cellular model predicted her condition should be at this exposure duration. I told him there was no model for this exposure duration. He said he understood that. He was asking what the model predicted for any organism at 19 minutes under Class 7. I told him the model predicted unambiguous systemic failure and near total soft tissue breakdown well before the 12-minute mark. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said he see and went quiet. She exited the corridor at 22 minutes and 14 seconds. She walked through the egress seal, and the field cut off, and she stood in the decontamination antechamber while the array ran its post-exposure scans. She pulled back the hood of the monitoring chute. She ran a hand through her hair. She looked at the scan display on the wall, the one that shows the subject their own readings, and her brow furrowed slightly, the way someone's does when they see a figure that doesn't match what they expected, and they are trying to decide if they've misread it. I came into the antechamber. I told her the scan was accurate. She looked at me and asked if everything was all right. I said yes. I asked how she felt. She said the corridor was a little warm. She asked if we had anything to eat on the station, because she'd skipped her mid-morning meal and she was hungry. I told her I would have something sent. She thanked me and sat down on the intake bench and waited. The post-exposure scan completed 20 minutes later. Her aggregate cellular damage profile had returned, within that time, to a score statistically indistinguishable from her pre-session baseline. I filed the scan. I filed the dosimetry log. I filed Retha's cellular comparison notation. I wrote the incident report in language that was as technically precise and as personally restrained as I could make it. I do not believe I succeeded entirely on the second count. The Institute's response, when the report reached the board, was to quietly retire the Universal Radiation Lethality Classification Framework for Homo sapiens pending the development of new assessment criteria. That was 4 years ago. New criteria have not yet been developed. The working group assigned to the task has expanded twice. I understand they are still working. I have been asked, in each of my 3 testimonies, whether I believe Specialist Osei was typical of her species, whether the cellular repair rate we observed was an outlier, an individual variation, an anomaly attributable to genetic difference or prior exposure conditioning. I have reviewed the literature that has emerged in the 4 years since. I have consulted with 3 xenobiologists who have conducted their own exposure studies on human subjects at other institutions since our session was published. I have reviewed those results. Specialist Osei was not an outlier. I was asked, in my second testimony, what ceiling I believed applied to human radiation exposure. I said I could not answer that. I was asked the same question in my third. I said the same. I am saying it again now. For the record, I do not know where the ceiling is. I know where it is not. It is not at 4 minutes under Class 7. It is not at 12. It is not at 22. Beyond that, I can only tell you that the Institute has been trying to find the answer for 4 years, that we have not found it, and that the human in my antechamber sat on a bench and ate a protein meal and said the corridor was a little warm. That is the full account. I have nothing to add.